Have you ever wondered why the Jewish people, who had waited centuries for the Messiah, ultimately rejected him? How could they not recognize the very one their prophecies spoke of? And what if their rejection was actually part of a divine plan that changed the course of history? Now, picture this. A man heals the blind, raises the dead, and speaks with an authority unlike anyone before him. Crowds gather, some in awe, others in fear. The Pharisees whispered among themselves. The Roman officials watched closely, and the common people asked, "Could this be him?" Yet instead of embracing him, they demand his crucifixion. Why? Was it fear, misunderstanding, or something deeper? Something that still resonates today. Stay with me, because this story not only changed history, but continues to shape the world we live in today. The rejection of Jesus by the Jewish people remains one of the most perplexing and profound mysteries of history. It raises questions about expectation, faith, and divine purpose. But this is more than just an ancient debate. It affects how we understand salvation, prophecy, and our relationship with God today. Imagine this: you've spent your entire life believing something to be true. Then, suddenly, everything shifts. Would you embrace the change or resist it? That's what happened when Jesus came. He didn't fit their expectations, and many couldn't let go of their own understanding. But what if we're still doing the same thing today? The Jewish people longed for a Messiah, someone to break the chains of oppression and restore their kingdom. But when Jesus arrived, he didn't fit their expectations. Instead of a warrior king, he preached love, humility, and a kingdom not of this world. The Pharisees saw him as a threat. The Zealots saw him as weak. The people were confused. Imagine being in their shoes. Could you have accepted a Messiah who challenged everything you believed? That's the question we need to ask ourselves today. The Jewish people had been waiting for the Messiah for centuries. They believed he would come as a mighty king, overthrow their oppressors, and restore Israel's former glory. Prophecies spoke of a ruler from David's lineage, one who would reign with justice and righteousness. But when Jesus arrived, he was different. He didn't rally an army, he didn't seek political power, and he didn't wage war against Rome. Instead, he healed the sick, preached love and forgiveness, and called people to repentance. That wasn't the Messiah they expected. Think about it. If you had spent your entire life imagining the Messiah as a warrior who would conquer your enemies, would you have accepted Jesus? The Zealots, a radical Jewish group, were furious that Jesus didn't fight back against Rome. The religious leaders were offended because he challenged their authority. And the common people? Many were confused. How could this humble carpenter from Nazareth possibly be the chosen one? Yet, Jesus was fulfilling prophecy in ways they didn't anticipate. Isaiah 53 describes a suffering servant who would be despised and rejected by men, carrying the sins of many. The book of Zechariah speaks of a king who would come, not on a war horse, but on a humble donkey. Jesus fulfilled these scriptures exactly, but many still couldn't see it. Why? Because expectations can blind us. When we cling too tightly to our own version of the truth, we risk missing what God is actually doing. This is a lesson that goes beyond history. It's something we all face. Have you ever been so set on your own plan that you ignored what God was trying to show you? Maybe, like the Jewish people of Jesus' time, you've struggled to recognize his work in your life because it didn't look the way you expected. Jesus didn't just challenge expectations, he redefined what it meant to be the Messiah. He spoke of a kingdom not built on earthly power but on spiritual renewal. He told his followers to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek, and to forgive 70 times 7. This was radical, it was revolutionary, and for many it was simply too much to accept. Imagine living under Roman rule, waiting for a deliverer, only to be told that the real battle wasn't against Rome, but against sin and separation from God. That's a difficult message to hear. It's easier to hope for a warrior than to embrace a suffering servant. But Jesus was offering something far greater than political freedom. He was offering eternal salvation. This rejection didn't take Jesus by surprise. He knew it would happen. In Luke 4, when he reads from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue and proclaims that the prophecy is fulfilled in him, the people's initial excitement turns to anger. Why? Because he suggests that God's salvation isn't just for Israel, it's for the Gentiles too. That was unacceptable to them. How could the Messiah extend grace beyond God's chosen people? And yet, that was always the plan. The rejection of Jesus by many Jews paved the way for the gospel to spread to the entire world. Paul later describes this mystery in Romans 11, explaining that Israel's rejection led to salvation being offered to the Gentiles. But he also assures that God's promises to Israel are not abandoned. This story isn't just about history, it's about us. How often do we reject what we don't understand? How often do we resist God's plans because they don't fit into our expectations? Jesus' mission was, and still is, challenging. He calls us to follow him, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it goes against what we think we want. So here's the question: are we willing to accept Jesus for who he truly is, not just who we want him to be? Are we open to seeing God's plan, even when it doesn't match our own? Because the greatest blessings often come in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, like the Jewish people of Jesus' time, we need to let go of our preconceived ideas to embrace the truth that's been right in front of us all along. The Pharisees and Sadducees were powerful figures in Jewish society. They controlled the synagogues, interpreted the law, and held influence over the people. When Jesus arrived, preaching a message of grace, love, and direct access to God, he threatened their authority. To them, Jesus wasn't just another rabbi. He was dangerous. He healed on the Sabbath, forgave sins, and even claimed to be one with the Father. That was blasphemy in their eyes. How could this man from Nazareth claim to be the Messiah? The fear among the religious elite wasn't just theological, it was political. Rome allowed the Jewish leaders a certain level of control as long as they maintained order. But Jesus' growing popularity, his massive crowds, and his radical teachings posed a risk. If too many people followed him, Rome might see it as an uprising, and the Jewish leaders would lose what little power they had left. In John 11:50, High Priest Caiaphas states bluntly, "One man should die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." In other words, Jesus had to be eliminated. But let's take a step back. Why were the Pharisees so blind to who Jesus really was? They knew the scriptures inside and out. They had memorized prophecies about the Messiah. And yet, when he stood right in front of them, they rejected him. The problem wasn't knowledge. It was pride. Jesus exposed their hypocrisy, calling them whitewashed tombs, Matthew 23:27. Beautiful on the outside, but spiritually dead within. No wonder they despised him. Think about it. How often do we resist truth because it challenges what we've built our lives upon? The Pharisees had spent their entire lives devoted to laws, rituals, and temple sacrifices. And now, Jesus was saying that faith in him, not the law, was the way to God. That was an earth-shattering concept. Would you be willing to abandon everything you believed if God showed you a new path? Jesus' authority didn't just challenge their traditions, it exposed their hearts. He ate with sinners, healed on forbidden days, and taught that God's love wasn't earned but freely given. This was radical, and instead of humbling themselves and embracing his message, they fought against him. They accused him of being possessed by demons. They plotted to trap him with trick questions. They eventually conspired to have him killed. Why? Because Jesus represented a truth that would overturn everything they stood for. But here's the twist. Jesus' rejection was part of God's plan all along. The very people who should have recognized him were the ones who condemned him, and in doing so they unknowingly fulfilled prophecy. Isaiah 53:3 says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering who knew what sickness was." Their rejection wasn't just expected, it was necessary. Through his death, salvation was open to all people, not just the Jews but also the Gentiles. So, what does this mean for us today? It's easy to look back and judge the Pharisees, but the truth is, we're not so different. How often do we reject what we don't understand? How often do we hold on to traditions, even when God is calling us to something greater? Maybe it's a habit, a belief, or even a position of power. Jesus still challenges us today, just as he did back then. This lesson is timeless. Jesus challenges all of us to look beyond rules and traditions and embrace a personal relationship with him. The Pharisees had everything they needed to recognize the Messiah, but their fear and pride blinded them. What about us? Do we recognize when God is working in ways we don't expect? Or do we, like the Pharisees, resist because it disrupts our way of life? The question is, will we humble ourselves and accept him for who he truly is? Or will we cling to what's comfortable and familiar? History has shown us that rejecting Jesus never stops his mission. It only reveals who's truly willing to follow him. Are you? Rome played a massive role in the crucifixion of Jesus. Many assume it was just the Jewish religious leaders who wanted Jesus gone, but the reality is more complex. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, was the one who ultimately sentenced Jesus to death. But why? Did he truly believe Jesus was guilty, or was something else at play? Pilate was in a difficult position. Judea was a political powder keg, Jewish revolts against Rome were common, and his main job was to keep things under control. If things got out of hand, it wasn't just the people who would suffer. Pilate himself could lose his position, or worse. He had already faced political trouble before, and another uprising could be the end of his career. So when Jesus was brought before him, Pilate wasn't thinking about justice, he was thinking about survival. Pilate wasn't interested in Jewish theology, he didn't care about messianic prophecies, he cared about keeping the peace and his political career. When Jesus was brought before him, Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" John 18:33, Jesus' response was profound. "My kingdom is not of this world." John 18:36. That should have been Pilate's moment of clarity. Jesus wasn't a political threat. And yet, despite declaring, "I find no basis for a charge against him," John 18:38, Pilate caved to pressure from the Jewish leaders. So why did Pilate give in? Politics. The Jewish leaders played their hand perfectly. They told Pilate, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." John 19:12. That was a loaded statement. If news got back to Rome that Pilate had allowed a man claiming to be king to walk free, his career and possibly his life would be over. Pilate was afraid. He tried to shift responsibility, washing his hands of the situation, but history remembers him as the man who sentenced Jesus. But Pilate wasn't the only Roman involved. The soldiers mocked Jesus, placed a crown of thorns on his head, and brutally flogged him. The crucifixion was the most humiliating and painful execution method Rome had. It was reserved for the worst criminals, traitors, rebels, and the lowest of society. The fact that Jesus was crucified between two thieves was no accident. Rome wanted to make a statement. This is what happens to anyone who challenges our authority. Here's the incredible part. The Romans thought they were in control, but they were actually fulfilling God's divine plan. Jesus had to die not just at the hands of Jewish leaders, but through Roman execution, because prophecy said so. Psalm 22, written centuries earlier, describes a crucifixion in stunning detail. "They pierced my hands and my feet. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." The Romans, unknowingly, were fulfilling Scripture to the letter. What does this teach us today? Pilate had a choice. He knew Jesus was innocent. He had the power to release him, but he gave in to pressure, choosing self-preservation over truth. How often do we do the same? How often do we compromise our values not because we believe it's right, but because we fear what others might think? The lesson here? Just like Pilate, we often find ourselves in situations where standing up for what's right might cost us something: our reputation, our relationships, maybe even our job. The question is, will we stand firm or will we take the easy way out? Pilate chose self-preservation over truth. What will we choose when faced with a similar test? Pilate's story isn't just about history. It's about us. Every day we face choices that test our integrity. Do we follow the crowd or do we stand for truth? Jesus calls us to something greater than fear. He calls us to faith. The Romans thought they had control, but ultimately God's plan was unfolding. Are we willing to trust His plan in our own lives, even when the pressure is on? While many Jews rejected Jesus, something fascinating happened. Gentiles, people outside of the Jewish faith, embraced Him. Why? What was it about Jesus' message that drew them in when so many of His own people turned away? Let's step back and think about what life was like for Gentiles in the first century. If you weren't born Jewish, you were an outsider. The Jewish people had a special covenant with God, a history rich with miracles and divine encounters. Meanwhile, the Gentiles worshipped a multitude of gods, gods of war, gods of love, gods of the harvest. Their religions were full of rituals, sacrifices, and complex rules, but none of those gods offered what Jesus did: unconditional love and personal relationships. That's what made Jesus so radical. He wasn't just preaching to one group of people. He spoke to Samaritans, healed Roman centurion servants, and even praised the faith of a Canaanite woman. In Matthew 8, a Roman centurion comes to Jesus and asks Him to heal his servant. Jesus is amazed at the man's faith and says, "I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." Matthew 8:10. That's a huge statement. A Roman part of the empire oppressing the Jewish people had more faith than those who had grown up with the Scriptures. The Apostle Paul later explains this shift in Romans 11. He describes how Israel's rejection of Jesus made room for the Gentiles to be grafted into God's family. It wasn't that God abandoned the Jewish people, but that salvation was now open to everyone, regardless of birthright. This was earth-shattering. Before Jesus, Gentiles could worship God, but they were always considered second class compared to Jews. Now Jesus was saying that anyone, Jew or Gentile, could be part of God's kingdom simply by faith. Think about what that meant for people who had always felt excluded. Maybe you've felt like an outsider before. Maybe you've been told that you didn't belong, that you weren't good enough. That's what made Jesus' message so life-changing. He told people that their past, their background, and their status didn't define them. What defined them was their faith. This wasn't just a theological concept. It was practical. The early church, led by people like Paul and Peter, began spreading the gospel far beyond Israel. They preached in cities like Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome, places filled with people hungry for truth. And the response? Thousands upon thousands came to believe. Unlike the Jewish leaders who resisted Jesus, these people saw His message as the answer to their longing for something real. Jesus also brought something the Gentiles had never seen before: grace. Their religions were based on performance, offering sacrifices, following strict rituals, and trying to earn favor from their gods. But Jesus taught something different. He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. This was revolutionary. A God who wasn't asking for more sacrifices, but instead offering peace and rest. No wonder the Gentiles embraced Him so eagerly. Of course, not everyone was happy about this. Many Jewish believers struggled with the idea that Gentiles could be saved without following the Jewish laws. In Acts 15, the early church had a huge debate about whether Gentile believers needed to follow Jewish customs, like circumcision and dietary laws. But Peter stood up and said something powerful. "We believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are." Acts 15:11. That moment changed everything. Christianity wasn't just a sect of Judaism anymore. It was a global invitation to faith. So, what does this mean for us today? It means that Jesus' invitation is still open to everyone. You don't have to come from the right family, have the right background, or be a perfect person. Jesus is for the outsider, the outcast, and the seeker. The same message that transformed the Gentiles' lives 2,000 years ago is still transforming lives today. The question is, will we embrace it? The Gentiles accepted Jesus because they saw something real in Him: hope, love, and a way to know God personally. Do we see that same truth? Are we willing to set aside our own barriers and expectations to accept the gift of grace that Jesus offers? Because here's the reality. God's family isn't exclusive, it's open to all who believe. And that means no matter who you are, where you've been, or what you've done, Jesus is inviting you in. The only question left is, will you say yes? The rejection of Jesus wasn't an accident. It was a crucial part of God's plan. What seemed like a tragedy was actually the very thing that made salvation available to the entire world. If the Jewish leaders had accepted Jesus, would the message have spread the way it did? It's an important question to consider. Think about the disciples. At first, they believed Jesus had come only for Israel. Even after his resurrection, they were still focused on restoring the kingdom to the Jews. But then something incredible happened. The gospel began to reach beyond Israel. Peter had a vision in Acts 10 where God showed him that salvation wasn't just for the Jewish people, but for Gentiles as well. Paul, once a persecutor of Christians, became the greatest missionary to the Gentile world. This shift didn't happen by accident. It happened because Israel's rejection of Jesus made way for something greater. This was all foretold. In Romans 11, Paul describes how Israel's rejection led to the Gentiles being grafted into God's family. It was never about one nation alone. God's plan was always to bring salvation to the whole world. Jesus' rejection wasn't a mistake. It was a fulfillment of prophecy, part of a larger story unfolding before our eyes. But here's where it gets personal. What about us? How often do we reject Jesus in our own way? Maybe not outright, but in the way we ignore his call, put our trust in other things, or struggle to accept his plan because it doesn't match our expectations. The Jewish leaders clung to their idea of what the Messiah should be and missed the truth standing right in front of them. Are we doing the same? Jesus' rejection led to something amazing: salvation for the whole world. The question now is, will we embrace it? Because the invitation is still open and it's extended to each one of us. The story of Jesus' rejection is a reminder that God's plans are always bigger than what we can see. Sometimes, what looks like a failure is actually the foundation for something greater. Just like the disciples had to shift their understanding of Jesus' mission, we are often called to shift our perspective on how God works in our lives. Are we willing to trust him, even when things don't make sense? History has shown us that rejection is often the doorway to something greater. The rejection of Jesus by many of his own people was heartbreaking, yet it became the catalyst for the gospel reaching the entire world. But this story isn't just about the past. It's about us today. How often do we reject what we don't understand? How often do we cling to our expectations instead of opening our hearts to God's bigger plan? The Jewish leaders resisted Jesus because he didn't fit their idea of the Messiah. But if we're honest, don't we do the same? Maybe not in words, but in how we live, how we prioritize our lives, and how we respond to his call. The beautiful thing about Jesus is that his invitation remains open. It wasn't just for the Jews of his time or the Gentiles who later believed. It's for you, right now. No matter where you come from, no matter your past, Jesus offers grace, redemption, and a new way forward. The question is, will you accept it? The gospel is for everyone, those who are just now seeking answers, and those who are just now seeking answers. The rejection of Jesus reminds us that God's plans often look different than what we expect, but they are always greater. Maybe it's time to look at our own lives and ask, are we fully embracing his truth, or are we holding on to ideas that keep us from experiencing the fullness of his love? If this message has made you think, challenged your perspective, or even stirred something in your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Let's keep this conversation going. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever struggled with expectations about faith? Have you ever felt like an outsider? Your story matters. And if you found this discussion meaningful, I invite you to subscribe. We will dive deep into questions of faith, history, and life, and explore how they all connect. When you subscribe, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community of seekers and believers who want to grow in understanding together. Most importantly, take a moment to reflect. Jesus' invitation is still open, and it's for you. Will you take the next step in your faith journey today? Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking the next step, even when we don't see the whole picture. So, if something in today's message resonates with you, don't ignore it. Take a step. Whether that's praying, seeking, or simply opening your heart to the possibility that God is speaking to you right now.